I've got to stimulate not only the foreigner for sure, but what often happens, and Malaysia is a test case for this frequently, is I discriminate against my domestic investors. My net on that may actually be zero. So instead of increasing net investment, I just simply change the composition from more foreign and less domestic. Not useful. You have seen that loss of investment in Malaysia in the capital flight of 97, 98. We could go on and on and on in this. But keeping some of that investment doesn't mean preventing it from leaving. That's not what I'm saying. You want that investment to seek its highest returns, but you would like it to at least include on the list of candidates and places to consider investing your own backyard. So point number one, competition is great. Point number two, and intergovernmental competition is high. Point number two is it's not just foreign investment. And point number three, when governments compete for investment, they need to think like firms. Okay? So how do companies compete? They have price and they have non-price competition. Right? What do I mean by price competition? I can alter a firm's cost of capital by giving it land, not giving it land, by the taxes I charge it or don't charge it, by a whole bunch of things that I do. Price competition is important, but it's important largely to match your competitors. No country, no jurisdiction differentiates itself through price competition. The best you can do is match your competitors. Why? Because investors will shop the idea around, and then once you tell me you'll give me, you know, a 2% tax rate, I'll lie to him and say you just said you'll give me zero, and it's only quite natural to. So you'll match on the price. The more important one, but the more subtle one, therefore the harder one to do, is the non-price competition. So how do you compete in a non-price way as a government? Well, it's typically a longer-term way. A tax holiday is an easy thing, and who knows if it even has any value. Remember, a tax holiday only matters if you make profits. 1 out of every 5 foreign investors in this country fails. So then that tax holiday mattered little to them. But the non-price competition tends to be longer-term investments. They tend to be in infrastructure, or infrastructure broadly defined. So it may be in educating my workforce. It may, all that kind of stuff. So it tends to be on the softer side of the ledger. Yet it is here that governments have a greater chance of differentiating themselves one from the other. You match the price competition and you differentiate yourself in these other non-price ways. But understand, just to take one dimension, education. In the case of South Carolina, the state of South Carolina has 0 aerospace engineers. We just attracted an aerospace company that's going to hire 3,500 aerospace engineers. We better figure something out quickly. Unfortunately, education is a long cycle business, right? I start them when they're 5, they pop out the other end when they're 25 or 30 or however long I keep them. So I can keep charging them more money, and then I finally give them a degree. And you know, that's a long cycle business. I don't fix that overnight. So governments tend to focus disproportionately on price competition because it's something they control very quickly, whereas the real differentiator is this other stuff. So therefore it requires thinking in advance. And you can see just within Malaysia, those states that have been far more successful in attracting investment have thought of it in this far more comprehensive way that includes training and all these other sorts of things, and the general marketing that goes with that. So those are sort of the dimensions of the story. Competition is there, it matters, it's not just foreign investment, it's any kind of, including state investment. And the third is, it's not all just price, you have to match price and then really differentiate yourself in other ways.
Hi, I am Roshan Arabegum from this study UKM. First, I would like to thank you very much for your very good presentation, which gives a good explanation and easily understandable. Not only for economists, I'm sure for non-economists also will understand from your presentation and discussion. So I have 2 points in my mind. Okay, first, you have shown the figures between China and India, between various sources of economics and productivity variation. So I'd like to know from you that what are the factors or drivers, contributing to this variation of productivity between the economies such as China or India, and even the economic data shows that the USA's they have deteriorates their unemployment rate, as well as many US Americans are losing their jobs. But if we compare the productivity between USA and other European countries, the big economies, for example, France and Spain and Germany, okay, so we can see the productivity is still very higher in US than Germany and France, although their economy is quite better than USA. So I'm looking what are the factors and drivers contributing to this variation of productivity. Okay, number one, this is my one point. Okay, the other point is you have shown all your data and information stock economies. All this is based on IMF projections. And so far we know that any kind of projections there is uncertainty, level of uncertainty which conflicts the credibility or reliability of the projections. So I have chance and opportunity to listen one of the senior economists from Oxford Economics. So they also projected that economics projection in terms of GDP and others. So and they claim that their projection is more reliable than others, IMF and others projections. So my thinking is, what's your rationale to choose the IMF projections in your data? Thank you very much.
The answer to, let's start from the last one and work backwards. The IMF was convenient. That was simply it. Remember, the IMF does not stand for the International Monetary Fund. It stands for I'm fired. I happened to be in Korea at the time of the financial crisis in '97, and I remember those signs: I apostrophe M F D fired. There's nothing sacred to that. It was the IMF or the World Bank or my big toe throbbing. But anyone who tells you that they have better predictors is trying to charge you a higher price. I can assure you they cannot justify it based on past performance. If this financial crisis has taught us nothing else, it is that humility is required on any kind of projection. Just to take the ones I gave you, which I chose the year 2012. If I looked at the IMF prediction for 2012, not now when I did it, but at 2006, they would be very different. In fact, India as number 10 actually shows up as Spain as number 10. That was before Spain collapsed. So our predictive capabilities are generally poor, at least with regard to change. Our predictive capabilities are amazingly accurate when it comes to the power of incumbency. So if I want to predict the top 10 economies tomorrow, the best place to start is to look at the top 10 economies today, because things don't change that much. Okay? Because we're talking about a $14 trillion economy in the United States, it only grows 1%. But growing 1% will kick off more cash than half the rest of the world. So it's what is the metric? It's back to each. If I want you to invest in a project of mine, I'm going to show you, and I'm generating a small amount of income, I'm going to show you a growth rate that looks impressive. If my growth rate's not impressive, I'm going to show you the absolute number. I've got to find some way to fool you. So every statistic both reveals and hides. Now to sort of your impossible question, which is around productivity. Let me illustrate that by looking at economies, just for a moment, at economies that have about 20 to 25 million people. There's no such thing as a normally sized economy. Populations vary all over the place. But what's interesting is that 20 to 25 million is a pretty common number. Malaysia would fit that, but Australia would fit that. Taiwan would fit that. Saudi Arabia would fit that. There's a large, in fact, I have a long list. And if I put all those economies up, it showed you roughly comparable populations. But then you choose what indicator you want. Number of trees burned per hour, GDP measured in number of cats per year. I mean, however you want to measure it, you're going to see wide variance, even though we all share the same population size. So we're converting that population into some measure of wealth, utility, whatever you want to call it, at very different rates. It should come as no surprise that the output per human being in Australia is higher than the output per human being in Malaysia, though your populations are roughly the same size, but that shows up on these charts. I multiply that output per human being times those human beings, I get an Australia that appears as number 15 or whatever it was among the top 20 economies. I will do the same multiplication for Malaysia. I can't remember, but I think it shows up somewhere around number 25, 27, something in that range. Why the difference? Look in two directions. One, look for the top line, and the other, look for the bottom line, to use a business term. On the top line, remember, a GDP is price times volume. It's like the revenues of a company. Price times volume. Volume is the GDP in real terms times relative prices. Australia happens to produce a lot of volume, but it also is producing a variety of goods, minerals, etc., that have been enjoying relatively high prices over a long period of time. When I have that high price times that high volume, with that 20 million plus population, I produce a phenomenal GDP. So part of it is on the top line. If you want to look at what am I selling, and what are people willing to pay for what I'm selling? Go to the other extreme. How do I produce those things? Well, Australia has gone through a massive transformation in its economy. When I first was in Australia in the late 1970s, that was before they made it into something that looked like an island. They were still digging it away. Australia had a phenomenal automobile sector. Had its own brand names in automobiles, a little bit like Malaysia. It lived with an interesting belief that it could have an automobile industry that was independent of the larger world order in automobiles. It's abandoned all of that. It's moved to industries, mining in particular, that were always there, but are phenomenally capital intensive. So I've taken that 20 million plus population and had it work with a lot of capital. Capital is stuck in those machines. I had to pay a lot of money to buy those machines, and I'm converting, those 20 million people are digging out this whatever, coal, iron ore, whatever it might be, taking a very small number of human beings to do a lot of volume simply because I've got a very capital-intensive set of industries. So what industries have I chosen to be in? If I chose tea, alternatively, I do a lot of work in the tea industry for Mr. Tata. We own Tetley, the brand. It's very labor intensive. It's very little machinery. The price per unit is very small. The volume is very high, but the price per unit is very small. There's really no way to mechanize it. So it's very hard to get higher output per unit of input. You got to find other ways to create value. So my point is that a much bigger conversation, indeed a lifetime's work on productivity, but look first at the top line. What are the prices I'm getting for the things I'm selling and how much